And you can start in 20 seconds.
Brilliant. Great. Welcome to this session. Good morning on briefing on the results of COP26. My name's Sagarika Chatterjee. My role is I'm Director of Climate Change at PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, which is an investor organisation with about 4,000 investor members or signatories, as we call them. And over the last 2 years, I've been on part-time secondment to COP26. And I'll go in a moment into my role. But first, just to do a tiny bit of housekeeping, you're very welcome to ask questions. You'll see the Q&A tab. Please do put them in there throughout the session. When I see an interesting question, I'll either leave it for the section towards the end, or I might just break up what I'm saying and ask you a question. And if I can't answer it, I'll try and direct you to the right person after this webinar. So what I'm going to cover today is a little bit about what my role was at COP26, so you have the context of my perspective, and then I'm going to cover where progress was made, go a bit deeper into private finance and specifically the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and then if we've got time, we're going to touch on some hot issues like China, banks, carbon markets, and then I'm going to turn a bit to what needs to happen next, specifically focused on policy and thinking about Egypt in 2022, where we'll have COP27. So, a tiny bit about myself and my role in COP26. So, I was specifically working for the high level champions. There are two high level champions for climate action called Nigel Topping and Gonzalo Muñez. Now, the role of the high level champions was created within the United Nations UNFCCC system back at COP21 in Paris. And the purpose of the high level champions roles, the people I was supporting, is to mobilize private sector action towards implementing the Paris Agreement and also act as a bridge between all the governments or parties to the Paris Agreement and the private sector to make sure that we can mobilize more action, but also that parties can see what the private sector is doing. So specifically, I was leading with a colleague called Sue Reed, who's based in the US, on finance. So this has given me quite a good perspective on the inside as to how the COP works. I've been at previous COPs before, but also at what were some of the key issues and where exactly were we in terms of the success by the end of it. So as you will have seen, the outcome or the decision was called the Glasgow Climate Pact. And overall, I do think this has made headway. However, it's nowhere near enough in terms of the policy acceleration that we need to see. We had one overriding goal for COP26, which I think I described over the last 2 years as keeping 1.5 alive. Did we do that? Yes, we did, but only just. It is a significant development, though, that I think at previous COPs, the focus has pretty much always been on below 2 degrees, and now that key IPCC special report on 1.5 and all of the pressure that there's been from civil society, from business, from the finance community, from youth activists has resulted in the narrative changing to 1.5. And obviously, having that narrative about 1.5 is one key component to being able to keep it alive as 1.5 becomes the North Star. So let's turn to some of the aspects of the Paris Agreement and COP26 and where progress was made. So I think COP26 has given us some honesty in terms of where are we. So the requirement through the Paris Agreement, as you know, is to complete, for governments to complete and submit their pledges, the nationally determined contributions. And we did have a major development with the US election outcome and President Biden rejoining the Paris Agreement and committing the US to net zero by 2050 at the latest. And obviously, it remains to be seen how this plays out in terms of implementation, the many challenges there are, but this was nevertheless significant. The other aspect, of course, was China. You know, of course, about the 2060 carbon neutrality agreement. And so I think in the first week of COP, China was actually relatively quiet. But what was interesting was we saw that US China cooperation agreement come through. And you may be thinking, well, what does that really deliver? Are we going to see China peaking emissions any earlier? We didn't get that. However, pretty important that similar to the time in the run up to the Paris Agreement, we have these two major superpowers and the highest emitters having a cooperation agreement and moving forwards, particularly if you think back to 2 years ago, where we were in terms of not only the US on climate change, but also those high emitters and what their cooperation levels were on this particular topic. I think the second thing is we've got several hooks now from COP26 that we can really move forward on. So one was on just transition, and you had the South Africa deal with funding for decarbonisation of the power sector, very significant, potentially a model for other areas. And we also, as has been much talked about, had the first mention seriously of fossil fuels within the Glasgow Climate Pact. Very significant and gives us a lot of space with which to work with and demand more ambition in the years to come. And then I think the other component that's very significant is that governments have agreed through the Glasgow Climate Pact to come back every year. And this has been something that was building towards the outcome and the end of COP. Important because rather than waiting until 2025, which was the next formal period when governments would have to come back, the message has been to governments and has been accepted, at least in writing and in theory, that they need to renew their ambition and we can't wait that long. So I do think we have some of these hooks. I'm just going to cover some of the areas that I think are a little bit more challenging. So I think the first is we saw the primacy of domestic politics. And I don't want to get sidetracked into talking about COVID, but this has been a significant challenge. And I think one of the areas of controversy, rightfully, we saw in the lead up to COP was from developing countries, particularly around vaccines, inequality in terms of where vaccines are. And that also dripped into some of the initial conversations before COP26 in terms of what access would developing countries have to actually be at COP, who was going to fund their quarantines, who was going to fund their own vaccinations as well. Some of those issues were resolved, but not all. So that question of domestic politics continuing to override will, I think, remain an ongoing challenge. I think the other question, and one can, say that it's great to see that we had the big emitters cooperating. Obviously, the EU is an absolute front runner in the pack in all of this. But nevertheless, did we really see enough action? And, I mentioned the challenges in the US, China, obviously. Coal remains a massive, massive challenge. I think some of the focus turned to India, perhaps many would say unfairly. I'm not biased in this. I was rather looking at some of the analysis from the campaign groups and civil society, pointing to the fact that developing countries are going to need huge amounts of technical capacity building and huge amounts of public finance to be able to accelerate their transition in line with the objectives of the climate accord, of the Glasgow Climate Pact. So I'm just going to turn a little bit now to some of the specific developments that we saw at a policy level, and I'll recap those. So in addition to the US-China cooperation agreement and the Glasgow Pact that I've mentioned a few times, we also had the US-European pledge to cut methane, very significant given the potency of methane. And also we saw key announcements on deforestation with 100 countries committing to halt deforestation and to tackle nature by 2030. And with that, we also saw finance players stepping up in their own commitments around halting deforestation. We also saw a much more significant focus on adaptation and resilience. And as the physical impacts of climate change are already biting and will bite at 1.5, and even more so at 2 degrees, absolutely critical that this was higher on the radar so that governments around the world, as well as private sector, are thinking about and taking actions on resilience, and particularly for the 4 billion people in the world that will be impacted by the physical impacts of climate change. I think the other thing that I wanted to highlight, just taking a step back from the kind of the policy side and what government's committed to, is that this was a COP where we really saw the real economy, in other words, corporates, the finance sector, industry, very much stepping up and much more front and center. And so we had a UN campaign that I was involved in called the Race to Zero campaign. That was a way to enable private sector actors to take an action towards net zero by 2040, 2050 at the latest, involving setting a net zero target. And what we saw from that was about 4,000 corporates joined the Race to Zero campaign. Now, the reason that's relevant is to be able to meet their obligations from having joined the Race to Zero campaign, they have to set a near term target. So this wasn't about getting corporate or private sector actions by 2050. It was about 2025 and about 2030. And now, as COP is finished, we'll very much be looking to accountability and credibility. These were key themes that came up at COP from youth activists, from civil society, and also from the private sector itself, saying, we've got these high level pledges from the private sector. We really need to see the transparency, and we've had enough commitments. And some of the youth activists saying, empty promises, show us the actions that you are really going to take, show us the emissions reductions. We're only going to believe it once we see those. So I think that's also been a very interesting development. Another theme that very much came through from the private sector action was around sector breakthroughs. So there were 40 world leaders that backed 2030 goals for sector breakthroughs across power, road, transport, steel, hydrogen, and agriculture. And we saw the private sector itself providing much more analysis and action in terms of convening, working together around sector transition. So at the Champions, we published a piece of analysis called Financing Sector Transition, and that looks at net zero roadmaps and what exactly will be needed to finance the transition at a sector level. So I'm going to turn quickly now to private finance. So there was a formal finance day, and I think it's again fair to say, first time that we've really seen private finance playing a much more significant role. And specifically, this was through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which brought together finance subsector alliances from across insurers, banks, asset owners, asset managers, investment consultants, and service providers. And to be a part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, those finance players joined the Race to Zero that I mentioned earlier. So, in other words, they committed to setting near term targets. And so, altogether, about 450 financial institutions joined that Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. It was chaired by Mark Carney in collaboration with the Champions, who I work for. And buried, if you look on the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero website, you'll find all the details of what exactly they've committed to. And it's some fairly significant stuff, and it's going to require serious multi-year action. And you'll also find a progress and plan for achieving the transition to net zero. And it covers some fairly serious areas, including guidance from the finance sector on how the real economy or corporates should transition, agreement at a high level around what's a good practice transition plan for a finance sector, work around emerging markets and developing countries, and also around call to action. So, in other words, the finance sector asking governments to step up in terms of what they do. So I think what's going to be key over the coming year, and by the time of COP27, is seeing the delivery of those commitments from the finance sector. And as the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero spans those many different components and key players in the global financial system, we are going to see a step change in action, as well as a step change in terms of the scrutiny that those players come under. So I'm running a tiny bit short on time. We touched briefly on China. All I wanted to say is on that, 31% of global emissions, potential to be part of the solution, and also a potential victim of climate change given the low-lying East Coast. So no time to waste. Very much hope to see more action on that dimension. In terms of banks, that was a hot topic. It will be really worth you again having a look at what is the commitment made by the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which has brought together 90 banks, and together they account for about 40% of global banking assets, so very significant. And then finally, carbon markets. So what was really significant again at Glasgow was we did pretty much close the Paris Agreement rulebook. And so specifically Article 6.2, which enables countries to trade with each other, brings in a new mechanism which is now being set up, and a carbon accounting framework which will give much more credibility. So looking forwards, what exactly do we need to see by the time of Egypt and COP27? So PRI's view is we need to see much more policy ambition, and specifically that needs to be around carbon pricing, coal phase out, 100% clean power, zero emissions vehicles, low carbon buildings, clean industry, agriculture that's low emissions, and forestry. And you'll find some of our work on this at PRI on our website under a project we've had for a couple of years now that's been very popular with our investors called the Inevitable Policy Response. So as we turn our minds specifically to what we need to see at COP27, well, we expect that in Egypt there will be a significant pivot to Africa. This will be the COP of developing countries. Public finance will be very important, and also how MDBs and development financial institutions can work with the private sector and private finance to attract more capital. What kind of catalytic initiatives, what kind of financial engineering do we need to see the vehicles and make breakthroughs in terms of the mobilization of capital for emerging markets and developing countries? I think the other aspect will be we've had a focus on mitigation. Glasgow has given us much more focus on adaptation. This will be a COP where adaptation and resilience are again really front and center. And then turning finally to private finance on the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, that will now have a link to the Financial Stability Board, so the G20's regulators, so very significant as we bring in those regulators increasingly into the net zero dialogue. And I'd expect to see some specific outcomes in terms of published targets, and also a scale up in terms of action taken on retirement of fossil fuels and fossil fuel financing policies. So we've reached the end of our session. I saw that there was a question about sustainable finance strategy of China. I'm so sorry I haven't got time to answer that. I do think it's really key. I think the EU's international platform for sustainable finance will be very important in terms of keeping strong coordination going. I think there's a real risk with sustainable finance of fragmentation. Obviously, each region will have its slightly different approaches, but from a finance actor's perspective, particularly if you're an actor in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, we need to see a degree of convergence of ambition, clarity, and that the dictionary or the taxonomies, in other words, have a degree of alignment so that finance actors can take meaningful action, including in their own stewardship activities, and work with the real economy, corporates and sectors on their transition towards net zero. So if you haven't yet written your business plan or your action plan for 2022, I hope I've given you food for thought, and there is plenty to be doing. Please take a rest over the seasonal holidays, and then put on your boots to take a lot of action and move forwards in 2022. Thank you very much. And I'm just going to pass